Hello. This video was prompted by some recent events within the profession that have been a sort of cause for concern for me, and I know for a lot of other people as well. And specifically what I'm concerned with has been the kind of battle almost between clinical psychology and other branches of the profession or other specialisms. There's been a lot of bad feeling generated, I think, and I think there's been a lot of negativity generated. And the reason I think I'm most concerned with the way things have gone is that in the past, when it was apparent or it seemed to people that standards were different within different branches of the profession, the impetus has been for the branches with the, if you want a better word, lower standards, to change what they do and to come up to the mark, if you like, with the other branches of the profession. So, for example, clinical psychologists were the first to introduce doctoral level training as the standard for the profession. This was portrayed for a while as being elitist, but educational psychology and counseling psychology followed suit, and very soon they were opting for doctoral level qualifications for their own branches of the profession. In recent years, though, it's become apparent to me that the difference in standards between the three different branches of the profession that we're considering today, that they have been used to request and even mandate clinical psychology to drop its standards, so that in the recent revision of accreditation standards for clinical psychology, what seems to me to have happened is that where there were differences noted between the standards expected by clinical psychology and those of other branches of the profession, clinical psychology has been asked to change its standards and to revise them downwards, if you like, so that they weren't looking for more than other branches of the profession were looking for. One example of where this happened was in the expectations that a supervising psychologist of a trainee in a course of training should be a senior clinical psychologist, and this wasn't required by the other branches of the profession. So clinical psychology was asked why it was requiring it, and effectively being asked to revise downwards its standards. So for the first time ever, the existence of three branches within the profession is being used, if you like, to prevent or to drive down the drive for improvement, the drive to improve the professions. So rather than clinical psychology having, its standards and others trying to meet those standards, the expectation now is that no branch of the profession should have standards higher than the others, and that we're all the same and we should all remain the same. So this seems to me to be an impediment to the kinds of improvements that we've seen within our professions over the past 30 or 40 years, where we've moved from a situation of having very short courses with low expectations and qualifications that reflected those expectations, to a situation where we're now all doctoral programs and the standards are the standards that would be expected of doctoral programs. The other concern has been the sort of bad energy that seems to be about as well. I'm aware of the existence, I've seen some of them, of social media posts about very respected members of its profession of clinical psychology, and derogatory comments being made by them by people who are professionally qualified psychologists themselves. And I mean, I just find that extraordinary that we've been driven to a point where these differences within our profession are being used to launch personal attacks on, senior members of the professions. And I think that's not a good thing. The reason I feel I'm suited or placed to comment on this is, I suppose, my long history of involvement in training at a professional level in psychology. I was, one of my first involvements in this area was as chair of the management committee of PSI's own postgraduate diplomas. These were professional diplomas developed by PSI in the 1980s, and I was the chair of the management committee, which oversaw a qualification in clinical psychology, counseling psychology, and educational psychology, in which the standards were different but equivalent for all three branches of the profession. So that enabled me to get a good overview of the of what the three professions are like. More recently, I've been the director of the doctoral program in clinical psychology, but I was also for some time the director of postgraduate teaching and learning in Trinity. And I was in that position when the counseling psychology course in Trinity became a doctorate, and I was the person who had to take it to the graduate studies committee and argue the merits of the case that counseling psychology should be a doctoral level qualification. So I was fairly proactive in that process and invested a lot of personal capital in getting the outcome that was wanted by the people running the counseling psychology course. So I was in large part an agent, if you like, an active agent in securing doctoral level qualification for the course in counseling psychology. I was also president of PSI when educational psychology standards were being developed by the profession, and I helped to secure an increase in the expectation that educational psychology should be at least a 2-year qualification, whereas many within the profession were looking for a 1-year qualification, which I think would have done serious damage to educational psychology in terms of its credibility and comparability with other branches of the profession. So what I'm going to do now is look historically at our professions and to sort of see where this has come from and where it can take us. Historically, clinical and counseling psychology certainly emerged after World War II. We're all aware of this. World War I and World War II were important events that shaped the developments of our professions. So what we see after World War II, certainly in the United States, is the development of clinical and counseling psychology, but in a way that they were almost indistinguishable. It was hard to distinguish between the two, and when you read about them at the time, people are using the terms clinical and counseling psychology almost interchangeably. Then we get the Boulder Conference, which sets down the blueprint for clinical psychology, in which the scientist practitioner model was laid down as the blueprint for the profession. And at that point, then we see a slight separation of counseling psychology from clinical psychology. And counseling psychology at that point seems to diverge and to embrace a more reflective approach to training, which came to be known as the reflective scientist practitioner model. So unlike the scientist practitioner model, where the emphasis was on techniques and procedures that had a solid foundation in empirical knowledge, the idea of the reflective model was that the personal reflections of clinicians are as valid a source of information as empirical findings in shaping the professional practice of an individual. I'm not arguing for the merits of either of these. I'm simply saying that that was one of the major points of divergence between counseling and clinical psychology at that point. And we see then a separation of the two professions. And what you then see is that jobs are being advertised that clearly identify one or the other. Clinical psychology then, the PhD university-based clinical psychology programs are all at that point, the 1950s, they are all almost exclusively scientist practitioner based. The PsyD programs, which are outside of the institutional setting or the university settings, some of them are promoting the reflective scientist practitioner model, and we see that almost all of the counseling psychology programs around that time are promoting a reflective scientist practitioner model. So there's a clear separation in terms of the model of practice, the model of education that clinical and counseling psychology are embracing at that time. The other big difference would be, I suppose, an attitude to mental illness, where clinical psychology clearly affiliates itself with the medical model, and it is about the application of psychological procedures to alleviate mental illness, if you like, and that term was used, and it was used openly by clinical psychologists. Whereas counseling psychology doesn't sort of embrace that kind of language, and it's more about self-development and adapting to change and adjusting to trauma. The language is very different. It's not medicalized. It's quite separate. If we look in the UK around the 1940s and 50s, you'll see that there is a complete confusion between the terms. Certainly clinical and educational psychology are used interchangeably at that time, which is very interesting, I think. Particularly with children, you'll see jobs advertised as being for a clinical educational psychologist, and that term is used quite often in the literature, and it's only in the 1960s that you see a clear divergence occurring between those two branches of the profession. And similarly, counseling psychology begins to separate itself off at that point. In Ireland, in the 1970s, we see clinical psychology being developed very soon after the formation of PSI. Clinical psychology becomes a very active branch of the profession. But for quite some time, there's quite an overlap between clinical and educational psychology. So, for example, my first job after qualifying as a clinical psychologist was in, I think it was the clinic in Castleknock. I think it was a child guidance clinic. I think it still had that old term. And, part of my job was really an educational psychologist, and some of my salary was paid by the Department of Health. So I think it was 1/3 of my salary was paid by the Department of Health, and 2/3 was paid by the Department of Education, and 2/3 was paid by the Department of Health. So I was expected to function partly as an educational psychologist, and that was in the 1980s. That was in the mid-1980s. So, I know it's a long time ago, but I think people would be surprised to see such overlap between the two areas, even at that time. So what did training look like in clinical psychology at that time? Essentially, training was an apprenticeship. There was very little formal training. There were two schemes, I think, that I'm aware of that tried to sort of formalize the training of clinical psychologists. One was run by the Eastern Health Board in Dublin, and the other was run by St. John of God's. And these two schemes offered placement rotations for trainee psychologists, so that people were rotated through a set of placements within the organizations that gave them exposure to adult services, child services, and disability services. And that was supplemented in both cases by a seminar program and by journal clubs, and people were given time off to study, but it didn't lead to any formal qualification. And then we see in the late 1970s, we see clinical psychologists in Ireland casting around to create formal qualifications. And the two first courses in clinical psychology were the course at Trinity and the course at UCD. And the course at Trinity was a 3-year course. Even at that time, it was a 3-year training course full-time that led to not a university qualification, but to people completing the British Psychological Society postgraduate diploma in clinical psychology. So that, it's a curious situation. It's a very lengthy training. It's equivalent to modern training courses, but it leads to a postgraduate diploma in clinical psychology. The model of training at that time and of practice was very much the scientist practitioner model. There's very little talk about reflection and practice in those days. It was seen as desirable, but not equivalent to basing you did on empirical considerations. The approach to casework was hypothesis testing, and therapy was there was a very strong emphasis therapeutically on behavior therapy, applied behavioral analysis, and on cognitive behavior therapy. And to some extent, Kelly's personal construct theory figured a little as well. But those were effectively the training, the therapies that were considered appropriate for clinical psychologists in those days. And the key commonality of them was that they had that very traditional kind of empirical basis to them, that they were demonstrated to be empirically based. The other thing is that there was a very strong emphasis in those days on psychometric testing, much more so than there is today. And I'd say about a quarter of the work of the clinical psychologist in those days could be characterized as psychometric testing. The UCD course led to a master's in clinical psychology, and it also followed the scientist practitioner model, and its approach to therapy might have been in those days more eclectic than the Trinity course, and that may have been to do with the kind of approach of the people running that course. So the Trinity course is 3 years, the UCD course is 2 years. Both are closely associated with the health services. So the Trinity course was not developed by staff in Trinity. It was actually developed at the behest of the HSE, where the director of psychology in the HSE approached Trinity and asked Trinity to provide a training structure for clinical psychologists. So this was something that was very much coming from the HSE, and from the outset was run by the HSE and Trinity. Well, the predecessor of the HSE within those days was the Eastern Health Board. And similarly, the UCD course was very much run as a collaboration, a partnership between the UCD and the health service. So their job was to train people to work in particular organizations. Counseling psychology, the first courses in counseling psychology were in TCD and in UCC. These courses were 1 year long. The emphasis was on the reflective scientist practitioner model. The job description was very much therapeutic. There wasn't an emphasis on formal psychometric assessment. It wasn't emphasized. And most people did not move into the health service. They moved into private practice, and they worked in the voluntary sector. And they provided a very important sort of role within those sectors. And, I was a, contemporary of many people who were training in counseling psychology in those days, and they saw themselves as being very different from clinical psychology and rejected a lot of the values of clinical psychology, the scientist practitioner model, and its emphasis on particular forms of therapy. So there's clear distance, if you like, between the two approaches in those days, both in terms of the duration of training, the nature of the qualification, and in terms of the values of the two professions. Although, there is overlap in terms of what they're doing, but they're clearly distinguishable. Even if you come up to 25 years ago, then counselling psychology is by then is a 2-year course leading to a master's. It's still entirely based in the university. The research is both quantitative and qualitative, but its research is more qualitative than quantitative. And as recently as 2000, the accreditation criteria did not even mention mental illness. So it's not even mentioned in the accreditation criteria up to 20 years ago. And there was no requirement in their training courses for placements in the health services. And philosophically, it's about adjustment to challenge, self-development, not about the treatment of mental illness. And mental illness doesn't really feature in the language of counselling psychologists in those days. So you can see that the two professions are very different at that point. I'm not going to talk about educational psychology at this point because my knowledge of educational psychology is a bit more sketchy. So I'm going to sort of stick to counselling and clinical psychology at this point. So 2000, there's a clear distinction in terms of the length of training. Clinical psychology is 3 years, counselling psychology is 2 years. The level of the award, PhD versus master. The nature of research, clinical psychology emphasizing empirical quantitative research, counselling psychology emphasizing qualitative research. There's a difference in terms of the acknowledgement of the validity of the construct of mental illness and the use of that within course documents and the profession itself. The location of training is different. Clinical psychologists are trained in the health service. Counselling psychologists is a much more flexible approach to the locations of training. The model of training is different. One is based on the scientist practitioner model. The other is on the reflective scientist practitioner model. And in terms of the job description, then there's also a difference. Clinical psychologists do more psychometric assessment. Counselling psychologists are more involved in therapeutic work. So what happens then? Since then, what has happened to sort of, firstly, make the professions more similar, but secondly, drive them apart in terms of, the respect they show for each other, which is a curious thing. I suppose what's happened is that as you become closer together, we've seen each other more as rivals, and that's caused problems. So what has happened then in the interview? Well, one of the most significant things that I think has happened was that the territory that was well occupied and well served by counselling psychology began to be eroded to some extent. So what we get is the development of a kind of a large number of therapy courses. Psychotherapy training becomes very prominent, and people are qualifying in psychotherapy, but they're not psychologists. They're nurses, they're people from other disciplines who specialize in psychotherapy, and they begin to challenge, if you like, and to compete with counselling psychology in terms of the roles it used to occupy within the voluntary sector and in private practice. And counselling psychologists begin to turn then to the health service as being a place in which to work, which is very different from, if you go back to when I graduated, most counselling psychologists I knew just would not consider working in the health service. They looked at it as a hostile environment in which to work. So there was a big difference. So counselling psychologists at that point begin to look to the health service as being a place to get jobs, because there's competition, I think, from other therapies. Then we get a change in the pattern of work of clinical psychologists. So the mix of assessment and intervention work altered, and there's plenty of data on this to show that the amount of formal assessment conducted by clinical psychologists has decreased significantly over the period that we're talking about. So the percentage of time in assessment goes down to an extent that, I've heard some clinical psychologists using it almost as a badge of honor that they've never used a Weiss or Wechsler in 20 years, so it's almost used as a badge of honor. I wouldn't be involved, so it's testament to the low status of assessment within the profession. Many clinical psychologists now engage exclusively in therapy, which was how counseling psychology was up to then. The other big difference since I've become involved in clinical psychology training has been in the emergence of qualitative methods as a means of conducting research. You go back to when I trained, it simply could not have happened. You could not do qualitative research. You did quantitative research. That was the scientist practitioner model. That was the model our profession was based on. And now what we see, and again, there's no value judgments here, it's just commenting on the change. I'd say about 60 to 70% of the research conducted by clinical psychology students is qualitative. And I think that is not distinguishable from the numbers that we see in counseling psychology. In recent years, I've even seen, quite extreme versions of the reflective model being applied in a research context. So that, for example, the kind of emotional reaction of an interviewer had been used as data, not as the interpretation of data, but as data in a study that I've encountered in recent years. And that's very far from the scientist practitioner model that would have characterized the profession up until 20 years ago. So there's a big change in the type of research, and there's also been a change in the model of training. So there's been an increasing emphasis on the use of personal reflection, and personal reflection not just as a thing to do to improve your practice, but as an equal to empirical knowledge in terms of developing your own skills. So personal reflection is equal in status now in terms of many people's focus, and in terms of the value placed on it. It's equal to empirical knowledge, which again, it's not something I'm judging, it's just a reflection that this has happened, and that there has been a significant change. The other thing we now see is that clinical psychologists are more openly challenging the construct of mental illness, and certainly the BPS division of clinical psychology has done a lot of that in recent years. We also see a mandating of personal therapy on many clinical psychology courses, and a shift in the mix of intervention and therapy in terms of the workload of the clinical psychologist. So all of these things are significant. So if you look at changes in counseling psychology, we see almost the opposite. We see a shift to a doctorate, we see a lengthening of training. So now training is 3 years long and it leads to a doctoral level qualification. There's now emphasis on formal assessment, which was not there in the past, was not mentioned in accreditation documents. We also see an embracing of the need for evidence base in evaluating therapy. And we see a good balance of research in terms of qualitative and quantitative research. And the mix now is indistinguishable from the mix in clinical psychology. We also see an acknowledgement of the existence of mental illness and explicit teaching on this. So you'll see in counseling psychology courses lectures on mental illness. You'll see the word used. You go back 20 years, that's not even required. We also see the development of placements in health settings and the requirement of a lifespan approach to placements. Now, one of the other things we see is that these changes are so dramatic and so noteworthy that many people within counselling psychology are not happy with this. And, I met a senior member of the counselling psychology profession from the UK who commented to me that counselling psychology had become clinical light, that it was aping clinical psychology, but that it was clinical light. It was still trying to be counselling psychology, but it was effectively clinical light. That's not me, that's a member of counselling psychology profession saying that. And a number of people have reflected similar views, that counselling psychology has moved away from its old kind of value-based approach and has shifted towards a more kind of empirical emphasis, as would have been the case in clinical psychology maybe 20 years ago. And it's distressing to, I think, hear that, that a distinctive and noble profession is being described in the sort of pejorative terms that it is now described in by some members of the profession. And that must be difficult within the profession. Within clinical psychology, there's, I suppose, these things have existed in parallel for a long time. And I suppose there's more tolerance of different views. It's not seen as a threat to the identity of the profession. I think those of us who would have been on the empirical end of the continuum are now kind of allowing that there are different ways of doing clinical psychology and sort of just getting on with it. So where does that take us then? What am I proposing here? What I'm suggesting is that, and I haven't really talked about educational psychology up to now, but I think some of the changes in educational psychology mirror the kinds of changes we see in counselling psychology. We see educational psychologists, although they're involved in a more restricted age range, what we see is that they're moving away from assessment to interventions. They are embracing the scientist practitioner model, and that, to some extent, in terms of what they're doing with children, is not entirely distinguishable from what clinical psychologists do with children. There's huge overlap, and however, the range of clients with which they work, the age range is different. So what I think you can see is that there is now considerable overlap between the professions. And some people use that as a reason, and that's it's entirely legitimate to say that our job opportunities shouldn't distinguish between the label attached to the specialism. What I would argue is that if we have become so similar, and I think we have become very similar, that we should just face up to that and just become one profession. That we should all just call ourselves clinical psychologists. I think my reason for saying that is not, just because I'm a clinical psychologist. It's because it's a more recognizable term for the public. The name has better currency within health services because it's been more long, it has a longer history and it's been established for a long time. So what I'm suggesting is that we simply bite the bullet and merge the sub-disciplines of our professions, and that in all areas we adopt the highest standards that exist. So, for example, in terms of the requirements for placements, which I think are higher for clinical psychology, we adopt those. In terms of the standards of training in psychometrics, we might adopt the standards of educational psychology. In terms of personal development aspects of courses, I think counselling psychology probably has a longer track record and better track record of doing that bit than the others. So that we look to the branches and that we adopt the highest possible standards in each branch. And that rather than using comparisons across the different sub-disciplines as a reason for driving down the standards of the highest, we should use the highest standards within any of the professions to drive the standards of all of them. But the only way to do that is for us all to become the same thing. So I'm suggesting we abolish the titles educational and counseling psychology, and that we all become clinical psychologists, that there be a grandparenting clause which would allow everybody who's already practicing in some area of the profession, grandparent them into the new profession, and that we simply set about then developing a single applied profession that would be applied to health and educational services, that we adopt a single rubric where we have the highest possible standards and where there's no competition between us for resources, that we're not tempted to drive down our own standards to make us seem more competitive than the other branches, where we're all arguing together for psychology, where the arguments are about justifying the potential and the contribution of psychology to human suffering and well-being, and not at infighting and division. And I think that this would be a much more fruitful way forward. The other thing, which is almost coincidental, is that when we look at what Cora is proposing, it's actually proposing to do something similar, but in an unplanned, unsystematic way. So what I'm saying is that we seize the initiative here ourselves, and we're proactive in shaping. If Cora is saying it will only identify a single profession within the health sphere, why not shape that profession for ourselves? It may be possible then to subdivide the profession in terms of care groups. So there may be people who graduate more specialised to work with children, others who may be more specialised to work with adults or in disability. You know, that's something I think we can talk about. But I really do think that the divisions that exist are not helpful. They're counterproductive, and they've eaten up a lot of time and a lot of resources and a lot of energy. And they've also been a source of bad feeling, and I think some unprofessional behaviour on the part of some individuals who've engaged in sort of negative campaigning against sort of senior members of our professions. So I'm going to leave it at that and hope that this might generate some discussion, some debate. So thank you very much. I'm Kevin Tierney. I'm the course director in clinical psychology at Trinity, and hopefully that will be a bigger course in some day in the near future. Okay, all the best, bye.